Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read Job 34 and talk about fairness. Job 34 focuses on a man named Elihu. Elihu probably lived around 2000 BC. Elihu was going through life, and one day he learned that a very wealthy man named Job had lost everything. All of his possessions were destroyed, all of his children were killed, and Job himself was afflicted with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Now the natural question was, why? What happened? Well, there was three men named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar went to visit Job, and they went to try and encourage him and also try to help him understand what had happened. And there was a long dialogue between these three men and Job, and during this dialogue they tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. Job, on the other hand, he insisted that he was innocent. He insisted that God had turned against him for some reason. And as the dialogue went on, Job started to complain about God and demand that God explain why this had happened to him. Well, Elihu was there listening to all this, and he listened in silence. But as he listened, he got more and more agitated. He was agitated because these three men, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, were not able to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. And he was agitated because Job was more and more blaming God and complaining about God and God's treatment of him. So the dialogue went on and on. Elihu got more and more agitated. And finally it gets to this point, and these four men gave up. Job could not convince those three that he was innocent. These three could not convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. And so they ceased. At that point, Elihu started talking. The passage we're going to look at today, Job 34, is represented by the second box here. And all of Elihu's speeches here are a response to Job, specifically Job's claims that he was innocent and that God had turned against him. So let's get started with Job 34, verse 1. Then Elihu continued and said, "Hear my words, you wise men, and listen to me, you who know." Now, the pronoun you is plural. In the English language, we can't differentiate between a singular you and a plural you. But in biblical Hebrew, they could. And we know that this pronoun here in Hebrew was plural, so that means that Elihu is speaking to all of the men and not just Job. And Elihu is essentially asking these men to listen to him. Verse 3, "For the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose for ourselves what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good." Now, starting in verse 5, Elihu summarized what Job had been saying throughout this dialogue. Notice a single quote here and the end quote here. So from here down is a quotation of what Job had been saying. For Job has said, quote, "I am righteous, but God has taken away my right. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression." Now notice the word righteous. Job claimed to be righteous. And notice the word right. It occurs twice. And then Job used the word incurable to say that his wound is incurable, his suffering and his agony was incurable. Now, as I said, this is Elihu's summary of what Job had said, and Elihu was pretty accurate. This is a pretty accurate summary of what Job had said throughout the dialogue. He accused God of taking away his right. He went so far to say that God had wronged him. And also throughout the dialogue, Job had insisted he was innocent. He said, "I am righteous, I am without transgression." And so this is an accurate summary of what Job had said. Now, verse 7 is Elihu's response. "What man is like Job, who drinks up derision like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity and walks with wicked men?" Now, notice the word derision. Obviously, Elihu thought that Job was delusional and not dealing with reality. Notice also, Elihu accused Job of walking with wicked men. And in Elihu's opinion, it's because he was walking with wicked men, his iniquity, that had caused Job to be suffering the calamity that he was suffering. Now in verse 9, Elihu quoted Job again. "For Job has said," and then notice the start quote and the end quote. Job has said, It profits a man nothing when he is pleased with God. Now, what Job meant by this was Job believed that he was pleased with God. Job believed that he was faithful to God and that he followed God and that he always obeyed God. And Job essentially said that it doesn't profit a man to do that. It doesn't profit a man to obey God and follow God and be pleased with him. And Job's reasoning was Job had been pleased with God, and yet Job suffered all this calamity. God did not protect him from this calamity. And so Job essentially said that it doesn't profit a man to be pleased with God, because even though you're pleased with God and you follow God and obey God, God's not going to protect you from suffering and from calamity. Essentially, Job said that God is not fair. That's more or less what Job was saying here. Now, Elihu responded to that, and this is Elihu speaking. Therefore, listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to do wrong. For God pays a man according to his work, and makes him find it according to his way. Surely God will not act wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Notice the word pays. Elihu stated very clearly that God pays a man according to a man's work. So Elihu believed that if a man was righteous, then God would pay a man accordingly and make him prosper. Or if a man was wicked, Elihu believed that God would pay the man accordingly and make him suffer. Notice also Elihu went so far as to use the word pervert and say that the Almighty will not pervert justice. So in other words, justice is to make good people prosper and make wicked people suffer. And Elihu stated that the Almighty is not going to pervert justice. He's not going to make the good people suffer and let the wicked people prosper. Again, that's Elihu's opinion here. Starting at verse 13, Elihu started talking about God's sovereignty. And his point was, God is sovereign. God has control over everything, which means God has control over Job's suffering. So God could have prevented Job's suffering. He could have stopped Job's suffering, but he didn't. So let's read these verses starting at verse 13. Who gave God authority over the earth? And who has laid on him the whole world? Now these are rhetorical questions. Obviously the answer is no one. God had authority by virtue of the fact that he's the creator. If God should determine to do so, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together and man would return to dust. Elihu simply pointed out that all of us humans were alive because God wants us to be alive. If God would just withdraw his breath and his spirit, then all men would be dead just like that. Starting at verse 16 and into 17, Elihu asked Job a very good question. Here the pronoun you is singular. The Hebrew pronoun is singular, so we know that Elihu is talking directly to Job. But if you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. Shall one who hates justice rule? And will you condemn the righteous mighty one? Again, that's a very good question. Throughout that dialogue, Job had essentially said that God was wronging him. And here Elihu is asking Job, are you sure that you really want to condemn God? It's a very good question. Verse 18, Elihu started talking about God's sovereignty again. God says to a king, you're a worthless one. God says to nobles, you are wicked. God shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich above the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. In a moment, the rich and poor die, and at midnight, people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away without a hand. Starting at verse 21, Elihu started saying that God knows everything. And here, Elihu's point was that God is able to be just and fair and right because God knows everything. There's no such thing as hiding sin from God. This is Elihu speaking. For God's eyes are upon the ways of a man, and he sees all his steps. There is no darkness or deep shadow where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. For God does not need to consider a man further, that he should go before God in judgment. Now notice the word hide. Elihu stated very clearly that no one who does iniquity can hide themselves from God. Starting in verse 24, Elihu started talking about God's sovereignty again. God breaks in pieces mighty men without inquiry and sets others in their place. Therefore, God knows their works, and he overthrows them in the night, and they are crushed. God strikes them like the wicked in a public place, because they turned aside from following God and had no regard for any of his ways. So that they caused the cry of the poor to come to God, that he might hear the cry of the afflicted. When God keeps quiet, who then can condemn? And when he hides his face, who then can behold him? That is, in regard to both nation and man. Here Elihu's point was, when God decides to keep quiet, and when God decides to hide himself, there's no man nor nation that's strong enough to find God or make God talk. Again, that ties in with God's sovereignty. So that godless men would not rule nor be snares of the people. And again, Elihu was talking about God's sovereignty and God's knowledge of everything, God's power. And his point is that godless men will not rule nor be snares to the people, because God knows everything and he is fair and just and he punishes the wicked. That's according to Elihu. Starting at verse 31, Elihu pointed out that, no one really admits their guilt. Let's start. This is Elihu speaking. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastisement, I will not offend any more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will not do it again. And again, this is a question, and it was a rhetorical question. Elihu's point was, nobody does this. And he's simply pointing out that Elihu believed that Job was sinful, and he's pointing out that he was pointing out that Job didn't admit this any more than anyone else does. Starting in verse 33, Elihu said that Job was being unrealistic. Shall God recompense on your terms because you have rejected it? For you must choose and not I, therefore declare what you know. And again, that's a very good question. And it's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. God is not going to recompense on Job's terms. Starting in verse 34, Elihu simply said that Job was wrong. Men of understanding will say to me, and a wise man who hears me, and then notice the start of the quotation, and this will go on for a couple verses. And so according to Elihu, some men of understanding, some wise men had gone to Elihu and said this, starting at verse 35. Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. Now notice the word tried. They believe that Job should be tried for his sin. And notice the word multiply. Job not only multiplied his words, but his words were against God, therefore Job was multiplying his sins. So, what we saw here, Elihu believed that God is fair. Job believed that God is not fair. Now, what none of these men knew was the real reason that Job was suffering. But we know the real reason because we have the whole story of Job. What had really happened was there had been a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan, and Yahweh had pointed out to Satan that Job was very righteous. And the first couple chapters of Job tell us very clearly Job was a very righteous man. Satan's response was the only reason Job followed God was because he was wealthy. Satan said that if Job lost all his possessions, he would curse God. And so Yahweh gave Satan permission to go out and test Job, and that's why Job lost everything. That was Satan testing Job or trying to get Job to curse God. Well, Job did not curse God. Job stayed loyal to God until, when they got to that dialogue, then Job started going downhill a little bit and was blaming God, accusing God of wronging him. And so Job did not stay righteous throughout this, but at the very beginning of the story, we're told very clearly that Job was righteous. So what we see through this is that the story of Job itself tells us Job was right and Elihu was wrong. Job was right when he said God is not fair. Sometimes God does allow good people to suffer. Sometimes, many times, wicked people are allowed to prosper. And that's what Job said, and that's the opposite of what Elihu was trying to say. Now, as I said, all of this took place probably somewhere around 2000 BC, and we see from the story of Job that God is not fair, and God does not do things according to our concept of fairness. 2,000 years later, God became a man and came to earth as a man named Jesus. And while Jesus was on earth, he taught on many subjects, and fairness was one of the topics he taught about. And we're going to look at two passages where Jesus taught about fairness. The first one is from Matthew 20, and this is one of Jesus' parables. In this parable, Jesus basically taught that the distribution of expectations and rewards is not fair. Let's start at verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. And so they went. Again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, Why have you been standing here idle all day long? They said to him, Because no one hired us. He said to them, You go into the vineyard too. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first. When those hired about the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. When those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, These last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the whole day. But the landowner answered and said to one of them, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So again, what we see through this, and this is a parable about the kingdom of heaven, what we see in this is God is not going to distribute rewards according to our concept of fairness. And even the expectations were not equal. The landowner did not expect equal amount of work from all of the people and all of the workers, and yet he gave them all the same. And the same thing with God. God's not going to expect equal output from each of us. Now, the other passage we're going to look at is John 21. And this is Jesus talking to Peter. And here Jesus taught that the distribution of suffering is not fair. Truly, truly, I say to you, Peter, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now this Jesus said, signifying by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And when Jesus had spoken this, he said to Peter, Follow me. Now, notice it says that Jesus was telling Peter what kind of death he would die and glorify God. The Bible does not tell us how Peter died. There are some historical documents from outside of the Bible, from the first couple centuries AD, that tell us that Peter was crucified. And that certainly fits the idea that Peter would have been suffering and glorifying God. Now, I believe that Peter understood what Jesus meant. I believe Peter understood that Jesus was telling him that he was going to suffer. Now, let's keep reading. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Now, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that was John. And there had been a little bit of rivalry within the 12 disciples between some of these men. And so Peter has just been told that he's going to suffer. Peter sees John, and Peter knew that, when it talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved, in other words, John was more or less the favorite, and I think all the disciples knew that. So Peter was told he was going to suffer. He saw John, and he knew John was the favorite, and so Peter said to Jesus, well, what about this man? What Peter really meant was, Jesus, are you going to make John suffer too? Or what Peter meant was, Jesus, is this going to be fair? Are you going to treat me fairly? Or is John going to get a better deal than I am? That's essentially what Peter was asking. And essentially, Peter asked Jesus, is this going to be fair? Let's look at Jesus' response. Jesus said to Peter, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And so when Peter asked, is it going to be fair? Jesus' response was, don't worry about whether or not it's fair. You do what you need to do. You follow me and let John worry about himself. So, we saw, 2000 BC, we have the story of Job, and it's very clear that Job suffered even though he didn't deserve it, and so life was not fair for him. Jesus taught very clearly that life would not be fair. And so what does that mean for us out here in the 21st century? Well, obviously, the first thing we need to pull from this is life is not fair. And a lot of us who are parents, we've told our kids this over and over. Life is not fair. The distribution of wealth is not fair. The distribution of suffering is not fair. Distribution of beauty, intelligence, talents, athletic ability, music ability, none of that is distributed fairly. Some people who are very good people suffer. Other people who are very wicked people tend to prosper. So life is not fair. But there's something else going on in our society which this has an impact on. And over the last several decades in our society, we've had a lot of talk about gender roles. And the Bible has things to say about gender roles, the roles of men and women in the family, in church, and in society. And what's happening over the last couple decades, because of feminism, a lot of Christians are starting to, when they go to the Bible and form their beliefs about gender roles, they start with the idea that somehow it has to be fair. Because that's essentially what feminism is trying to do. Feminism is trying to make men and women equal. Feminism is trying to make things fair between men and women. The problem with that is the Bible very clearly tells us life is not fair. And the Bible very clearly tells us we should not expect fairness from God. And so when we go to the Bible and look to see what it has to say about gender roles and the differences between men and women, we can't start with the idea that somehow this has to be fair, because it's not fair. When you look at what the Bible says about gender roles, it very clearly is not fair. But that's not what we should focus on. Just like Jesus told Peter, don't worry about whether or not it's fair, you follow me. So too with us, as we think about gender roles, we can't focus on whether or not it's fair. We simply need to obey God. And likewise with Job, if you think about the life of Job, why did Job suffer? Job suffered because God was trying to prove a point to Satan. Job's suffering was a test to see how much Job loved God and how much he was willing to endure and still follow God. And so in our lives, as we go through life, and when life is not fair, if those of us, if good people are suffering more than wicked people, and we wonder why, we have to keep in mind that this is also an opportunity to demonstrate our love for God. If we continue to follow God and obey Him and love Him when we're suffering and when life is not fair, that demonstrates a lot more love for God than if we're following Him when life is great and wonderful and we have things better than, we have more than everyone else. And the same thing with gender roles. If gender roles, if men and women would follow what the Bible has to say about gender roles and it was fair, that doesn't demonstrate as much love for God as it does when we follow those gender roles when they clearly are not fair. If you'd like to see the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.